Have you ever wondered what it feels like to watch someone dig their own grave, all while they genuinely believe they are burying you alive? That was the look on Sarah's face when she sat across from me in that sterile, high-end conference room. The room was deathly quiet, the kind of silence that usually precedes a sentencing. She and her husband, Greg, were sitting directly across from me. They were wearing their best clothes, looking professional and concerned, playing the roles of the worried niece and the supportive nephew perfectly. In front of them, resting on the polished mahogany table, was a thick manila folder. They called it the incapacity declaration. They wanted to strip me of my power of attorney, declare me mentally unfit, and take complete control of my multi-million-dollar estate. I watched them closely. Sarah was trying to look sad, her eyes trained on the table, occasionally glancing up with a feigned expression of pity. Greg was trying to maintain a stoic, businesslike posture, but I saw the twitch in his jaw. They were nervous, not because they were doing something wrong, but because they were afraid I might actually fight back. They had spent months preparing for this moment. They had visited me every weekend, brought me gifts, helped me with my banking, and whispered in my ear about how I was forgetting things, how my memory was slipping, and how the stress was becoming too much for me to handle alone. They thought they had successfully gaslit an old man into submission. They thought they had turned me into a ghost in my own life. But I wasn't fighting back in the way they expected. I wasn't going to raise my voice. I wasn't going to plead for my dignity or beg them to see reason. In fact, I was the calmest person in the room. I sat back in my leather chair, watching the dust motes dance in the light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and I felt nothing but a cold, sharp clarity. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They saw a retiree with a fading memory and a heavy bank account. They didn't see the man who had spent 30 years in the world of high-stakes corporate risk mitigation. For 3 decades, I didn't work for a law firm or a charity. I worked for the people who clean up the messes that corporations make. My title was Senior Risk Mitigation Analyst for a Fortune 500 company. My entire career was built on the foundation of skepticism. When you spend your life analyzing contracts, hunting for embezzlement, and sniffing out fraud in billion-dollar deals, you stop seeing the world as people do. You stop seeing emotions, and you start seeing patterns. You start seeing the how and the why behind every lie. My job was to anticipate disasters before they happened. I was the person executives called when they needed to know if a partner was stealing from them or if a deal was a trap. I have spent thousands of hours in rooms just like this one, sitting across from men in expensive suits who thought they were smarter than me. I have dismantled arguments from some of the most dangerous people in the corporate world. I learned early on that people are predictable. They act on greed, they act on fear, and they almost always leave a trail. They think they are being clever, but they are clumsy. They are sloppy with their timelines, they are careless with their digital footprint, and they are arrogant enough to believe that nobody is watching them. My family made the fatal mistake of looking at my age and seeing weakness. They looked at my quiet demeanor and mistook it for cognitive decline. They didn't realize that the skills I used to dismantle international corporate fraud were not something you just lose with age. They are hardwired into my brain. If anything, age has only made me more patient. I have the time to look at the details that other people ignore. I have the time to track every cent, every email, and every false word. They wanted to declare me mentally unfit. They had brought documents, medical assessments, and even a cognitive evaluation signed by a doctor they had conveniently introduced to me a few months prior. They had all their bases covered. They had a narrative, they had the paperwork, and they had the confidence of people who thought they had already won. As Sarah reached out to slide that folder toward me, her hand trembling just a fraction of a millimeter, I didn't see a niece trying to help her uncle. I saw a thief trying to steal from a vault, completely unaware that the vault was booby-trapped. They thought they were the predators, but they were about to find out that they had walked directly into the cage of an expert who had been training his whole life for this exact kind of confrontation. I waited for her to speak, my face a mask of polite indifference, letting them enjoy their last few moments of victory before the architecture of their lie began to collapse. It didn't happen all at once. Greed is a patient predator, and Sarah and Greg were masters of the slow approach. They understood that if they tried to move too quickly, I might notice. They needed to manufacture a decline, a slow fade into irrelevance, where I would become a passenger in my own life, unable to manage my affairs or question their decisions. They started with the small things, the trivial annoyances that anyone would eventually dismiss as the normal forgetfulness of aging. My car keys would be moved from the hallway hook to the kitchen counter. Important mail, statements from my bank, investment updates, correspondence from my lawyers would simply vanish from the foyer table. When I would eventually ask about these things, the response was always the same, rehearsed to perfection. It was a look of exaggerated concern, a soft, patronizing pat on the arm, and the gentle lowering of their voices, as if they were speaking to a child who couldn't quite grasp the concept of gravity. "Oh, Uncle, I think you might have misplaced them. Are you sure you're feeling all right? You've seemed a bit scattered lately." They were planting seeds. They wanted me to doubt my own mind. They wanted to create a narrative that they were the only ones keeping my world together. I remember one Tuesday evening, about 4 months into their supportive campaign, Greg had come over, ostensibly to help me with some home maintenance, but he spent most of the time lurking near my home office. I watched him through the reflection of the glass door as he lingered by my desk. He thought I was in the kitchen making coffee. He was checking the position of my calendar, looking for any notes I might have left about my accounts. He was sloppy. He didn't realize that in my line of work, we never leave sensitive information out in the open. My desk was a decoy. My real financial records, the ones that mapped out the true value of my estate, were encrypted on a drive that required biometric verification to access. He was looking for crumbs, hoping to find a pattern of financial instability that he could use to justify a conservatorship. Then came the doctor, Dr. Aris, a friend of Greg's from a country club, or so they claimed. He started dropping by for what they called wellness checks. He was perfectly polite, always dressed in a crisp suit, but there was a slickness to him that set off every alarm bell I had developed over 30 years in risk mitigation. He didn't ask questions to gather information. He asked questions to manufacture a diagnosis. He would sit across from me, his tablet ready, and ask me to identify the date, the president, or to count backward from 100 by sevens. I played the part. I acted the confused old man. I would stumble on the numbers. I would hesitate, pretend to struggle with the date, and let my gaze drift out the window. I fed them exactly the footage they wanted for their eventual court case. But while I was performing, I was observing. I was watching Dr. Aris. I noticed that he never actually documented my responses in real time. He would nod, type a few things, but I could see the screen. He was drafting the report before he had even heard the answers. It was a pre-written verdict. They were so blinded by the potential payout. $1 million estate is a powerful motivator for the mediocre, that they completely underestimated my ability to process what they were doing. They made mistakes, though. Arrogance is a flaw that reveals itself in the details. Sarah, usually the more careful of the two, began to get impatient. I noticed it in her tone when she thought I wasn't listening. She would talk to Greg in the hallway, their voices hushed, but the frustration was clear. "He's not deteriorating fast enough," she whispered one night, thinking I was asleep in the den. "The lawyers say we need more documented evidence of cognitive failure Before we can file for the emergency transfer of power, we need to push harder. They started increasing the frequency of the assessments. They began bringing me supplements, insisting I take them with my evening tea. I never took them, of course. I would wait until they turned their backs to pour the tea into a potted plant. I wasn't going to let them drug me into actual confusion. I was staying clear-headed, sharp, and entirely focused on the trap I was building around them. I wanted them to build the structure of their fraud as high as possible. The higher they climbed, the harder they would hit the ground when I pulled the foundation out from under them. Every interaction was a data point. I kept a journal, a real, physical, leather-bound notebook that I kept tucked behind a loose brick in the fireplace hearth, far away from their prying eyes. I documented every date they visited, every missing item, every comment about my health, and every time Dr. Eris appeared. I was creating a timeline of their conspiracy. I was recording the evidence of their betrayal, piece by piece, building a case that would be impossible to dismiss. They thought they were isolating me from my life, cutting me off from the world, and turning me into a vulnerable, frightened old man. They didn't understand that by bringing me into their web, they had simply given me the perfect vantage point to watch them destroy themselves. They were the ones who were vulnerable. They were the ones who were out of their depth. They were walking into a room full of landmines, and they were the ones who had laid them out. I was just waiting for the signal to detonate. The shift from being the target to the predator was a quiet transition. It didn't involve grand gestures or dramatic phone calls. It happened in the late hours of the night, in the blue light of my monitor, while Sarah and Greg were at home, sleeping soundly and dreaming of their impending payday. I wasn't just sitting there, waiting for them to make their move anymore. I was auditing their lives, their actions, and every document they had ever presented to me. I was running a risk assessment on the people closest to me, and the results were damning. I started with the document they had left on my desk during one of their helpful check-ins, a power of attorney form they claimed I had signed during a period of forgetfulness. I pulled out my magnifying loupe, the same one I'd used for years to analyze contract discrepancies in corporate acquisitions. When you have spent 3 decades looking at signatures, you stop seeing them as handwriting and start seeing them as a biorhythm of the nervous system. A person's signature is a fingerprint of their intent. I looked at the signature on the form. It was close, I'll give them that, but it was too deliberate. There was a hesitation at the start of the capital letter, a slight drag in the ink flow where a natural signature should be fluid and continuous. It wasn't just a forgery, it was a traced forgery. They had taken a copy of a real signature, perhaps from a birthday card or a casual note, and carefully overlaid it. They were amateurs. Then, I looked at the digital trail. They had been reckless. Greg, in his arrogance, had sent a scanned copy of the document to my official email address, the one he had convinced me to let him manage. He thought it was just a formality. He didn't realize that every digital file carries a hidden history called metadata. I opened the file properties on my secure terminal. The document creation date was listed, and it told a story that destroyed their entire argument. The file had been created on a Tuesday at 2 a.m. in an office suite that wasn't mine. Furthermore, the software used to sign the document was an editing suite that logs every modification. The metadata showed that the document had been altered, layers added, signatures pasted, long after the time they claimed I had signed it in person at the lawyer's office. They hadn't just faked a signature, they had faked the entire event. I didn't stop there. I needed to know about the notary public, who had allegedly witnessed my signature. I did a quick background check using a subscription service I maintained for my old consulting work. It took me less than 10 minutes to find the truth. The notary's commission had expired 2 years ago. Not only that, but the address listed for the notary on the stamp was a vacant lot in a different state. It was beautiful, in a cynical sort of way. They had put so much effort into the lie that they forgot to check if the tools they were using were actually legal. They had built a house of cards, and they were walking around inside it, admiring the view, completely unaware that the structure was supported by nothing but expired credentials and bad intentions. I spent the next 2 weeks building my file. I became a ghost in my own house. I acted confused. I acted tired. I played the part of the frail old man perfectly, all while I was methodically printing out the evidence. I organized it into a binder, color-coded and cross-referenced. I had the forensic analysis of the ink. I had the metadata logs from the server. I had the public records proving the notary fraud. I even had a list of the dates and times Sarah and Greg had accessed my banking portal without authorization, which I had tracked by comparing their login timestamps to the times they were physically present in my home. There was a strange sense of peace that came over me as the evidence piled up. The anger I felt in the beginning had evaporated. Anger is a weakness. It clouds judgment and leads to sloppy mistakes. What I felt now was the cold, analytical satisfaction of a professional completing a difficult assignment. I was writing the end of their story, and the best part was that they were the ones handing me the ink. Every time they came over to check on me, I would thank them. I would smile and tell them how much I appreciated their help. I would let them talk. Let them brag about their future plans. Let them drop hints about how they were going to restructure my estate once they had control. I was recording it all. I had installed a high-fidelity microphone in my office, hidden behind a clock, and I had hours of audio of them laughing about how easy it was to manipulate me. I was no longer just the owner of $1 million estate. I was the curator of their downfall. I had all the pieces. I had the intent, the means, and the proof of the crime. The only thing left was to choose the moment of the reveal. I wanted it to be perfect. I wanted them to be so high on their own success, so convinced of their inevitable victory, that the drop would be as jarring as possible. I looked at the binder sitting in my safe, the heavy weight of it a silent promise of justice. They wanted to declare me mentally unfit. They wanted to take my life's work. I was going to let them try. I was going to let them walk right into the boardroom, sit down with their fake documents and their smug expressions, and then, at the very last second, I was going to show them exactly what a lifetime of being underestimated looks like. The trap was set. The bait was taken. Now, all I had to do was wait for the meeting. The day of the final meeting at the law firm was overcast, with a heavy gray sky that seemed to match the gravity of the room we were about to enter. I dressed in a sharp, dark suit, not because I wanted to impress them, but because I wanted to be comfortable while I dismantled their lives. Sarah and Greg were already there when I arrived. They looked polished, prepared, and predatory. They had brought their own lawyer, a man who looked like he had never won a hard case in his life. He was there to ensure the transfer of care went smoothly, acting as the final seal on their imagined victory. They greeted me with that same sickening fake compassion that had become their trademark. "Are you doing okay today, Uncle?" Sarah asked, her voice dripping with artificial empathy. I just nodded, sat down, and placed my heavy, leather-bound binder on the polished mahogany table. Their lawyer began the presentation. He spoke in long, drawn-out sentences about my decline, the necessity of protection, and the best interests of the family estate. Sarah and Greg sat there, nodding along, adding their own scripted anecdotes about my bad days and my confusion. It was a rehearsed performance, polished through months of practice. When they finished, the lawyer looked at me, waiting for the breakdown he had been promised. A moment of confusion, a tearful plea, or a sign of cognitive drift. He didn't get one. Instead, I opened my binder, I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the lawyer, my movements precise and deliberate. "Before we discuss the validity of these claims," I said, my voice steady, rhythmic, and perfectly calm, "I think we need to verify the paperwork." I slid the first document across the table. It was the power of attorney form they claimed I had signed during one of my episodes. This document relies on a notarized signature. However, if you check the digital footprint of the file, you will see it was modified on a private server, not at the office where it claims to be signed. It was a digital trace, not a physical pen stroke. I watched Greg's face. He stiffened, his eyes flicking toward the document, then back to me. "And about the notary," I continued, sliding the next page over. "I took the liberty of contacting the state board. This notary commission expired 2 years ago. The address listed is a vacant lot. It's quite difficult for a ghost to witness a legal document, don't you think?" The room went cold. The lawyer frowned, pulled the documents closer to his face, and adjusted his glasses. He started flipping through the pages, his confidence evaporating with every line he read. The air in the room seemed to get thinner. Sarah reached out to stop him, her face turning pale. "That's not. We didn't," she started, her voice cracking, the polished mask of the worried niece shattering in real time. Her husband was silent, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so tightly that his knuckles turned white. He was staring at the floor, his eyes darting toward the door, calculating the distance to the exit. The smugness that had been plastered on their faces all morning was gone. In its place was something much more visceral, raw, unadulterated terror. "I kept a record," I said, pulling out a printout of the timestamps I had tracked over the last few months. "Every time you entered my home, every time you accessed my computer, and every time you tried to confuse me with those supplements. You think this is just a family matter? This is evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud, identity theft, and attempted grand larceny. You wanted to declare me mentally unfit? You have certainly demonstrated that you are the ones who lack the foresight required to function in a civilized society." I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the table. I didn't need to shout. The facts did the shouting for me. "I've already contacted the district attorney's office. They are waiting for the final word on whether to pursue this as a civil matter or a criminal one. I suppose that depends on how much you have to say right now." I gestured to the phone on the table. The lawyer looked at me, then at his clients, and he realized he was representing criminals, not just greedy heirs. His professional mask slipped, revealing the fear of losing his own license by being associated with this mess. He looked at Sarah and Greg, his expression hardening. He knew they had lied to him, and he wasn't about to go down with their sinking ship. Sarah began to cry, not out of remorse, but out of fear. She wasn't sorry for what she tried to do. She was sorry that she had failed, and that the consequences were finally crashing down on her. Greg looked at me with pure hatred, but he was paralyzed. He knew that any move he made now would only make the police report worse. The silence in the room was suffocating. I watched them crumble. It wasn't the explosive confrontation I had imagined. It was a slow, agonizing dissolution of their pride. They had come here to take my estate, to put me in a home, and to control my future. Now, they were facing prison time, legal ruin, and the absolute destruction of their reputations. They were small people, and in that moment, as the reality of their failure set in, they looked smaller than ever. The room emptied with a sudden, clinical efficiency. Once their lawyer realized he was representing a sinking ship of fraud and incompetence, he gathered his briefcase and walked out, without a backward glance. He didn't even say goodbye to his clients. He knew, just as I did, that the evidence I had laid out on that mahogany table was airtight. Sarah and Greg were left sitting there, Two people who had walked in with the arrogance of winners and were now staring down the barrel of a ruined future. I didn't stay to watch the police arrive. I didn't need to see the handcuffs or hear their pleas. I had done my work. I stood up, buttoned my jacket, and walked out of the office into the cool afternoon air, leaving them to deal with the reality they had built for themselves. The legal process was swift and, for them, devastating. Because they had involved a fraudulent notary and tampered with digital files, this wasn't just a simple family dispute over an estate. It was a criminal matter. The district attorney had a field day with the evidence I provided. It was a textbook case of attempted grand larceny and identity theft. They didn't get a plea deal that let them walk away with a slap on the wrist. When you try to steal from the system using fake documents, the system tends to protect itself by making an example of you. They were charged. Their bank accounts were frozen during the investigation, and the public records of their trial became a stain on their names that they would never be able to scrub clean. But the legal punishment was only the beginning. The real consequence, the one that seemed to hurt them the most, was the social fallout. We lived in a world where reputation is currency, and Sarah and Greg were now bankrupt. Once the news of their arrest for attempting to defraud their own family member leaked into our social circle, the doors that used to be open to them were slammed shut. The country clubs, the charity boards, the business networks, they were all untouchable now. People are very quick to distance themselves from those who get caught being sloppy with morality. They weren't just seen as thieves, they were seen as losers. That to them was a fate worse than jail. I watched it all from a distance. I didn't reach out to gloat, and I didn't ask for updates. I simply returned to my life, the life they had tried to steal from me. I went back to my routine, the quiet, orderly rhythm that I had cultivated over years of professional experience. I sold the house in the suburbs, the one they had spent so much time lurking around, and moved to a quieter place, a space that was entirely my own, where no one had keys and no one had permission to enter without an invitation. I felt a sense of lightness, a freedom that I hadn't realized I was missing while I was constantly watching my back. People often ask me if I feel guilty. They ask if I regret handling it the way I did. The trap, the silence, the cold reveal. My answer is always the same. I didn't trap them. They built the cage themselves. They were the ones who decided that my life had a price tag. They were the ones who decided that my trust was a weakness to be exploited. I just held up the mirror so they could see exactly what they had become. Greed is a blinding force. It makes people think they are the only ones playing the game, while everyone else is just a piece on the board. They never stop to consider that I was the one who taught them how to play in the first place. This experience taught me something profound about human nature. We spend our lives building relationships, raising families, and trusting the people closest to us. We assume that because we share a bloodline or a history, we are safe. But the truth is much colder. You are only as safe as the integrity of the people you surround yourself with. True security doesn't come from a vault or a lawyer. It comes from knowing exactly who is in your corner and who is waiting for you to turn your back. It's a harsh lesson, but a necessary one. In the end, justice isn't about vengeance. Vengeance is messy, emotional, and impulsive. It requires you to lower yourself to the level of your enemy. Justice, true justice, is about balance. It is about letting the weight of one's own actions return to them. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to fight, and I didn't need to lose my temper. I just needed to be right, and I needed to be patient. You don't have to break the law to defeat someone who is breaking it. You just have to be the one who observes more, listens longer, and acts when the time is perfect. My family tried to take my future, but all they really did was show me that I was stronger than I had ever given myself credit for. And that in itself, is a victory that no amount of money could ever buy.